The History of Tasmania by John West, published in Launceston, Tasmania, 1852. Audiobook produced by Antique Books Australia, 2025. Volume 2, Chapter 42, The Aborigines, Section 1, 1643. At the era of discovery by Tasman, Van Diemen's Land was inhabited. He heard, or thought he heard, the voices of people and the sound of a trumpet. He noticed the recently cut notches, 5 feet asunder, on the bark of the trees, and he saw the smoke of fires. He inferred that they possessed some unusual method of climbing, or that their stature was gigantic. In the sound, the colonist recognizes the vocal cooey of the Aborigines and learns from the steps to the birds' nests that they then hunted the opossum and employed that method of ascent, which for agility and daring has never been surpassed. Thus, during more than 150 years, this country was forgotten, and such were the limits of European knowledge when the expedition of Cook was dispatched by Great Britain to explore this hemisphere. No navigator brought larger views and a temper more benevolent to the task of discovery. To some nations, he opened the path of civilization and religion. To this race, he was the harbinger of death. 1773. Furneaux, Captain Cook's second-in-command, first visited this country. He saw the fires of the natives 10 miles off. They had left their huts, formed but for a day, in which were fragments of fish, baskets, and spears. The British deposited gun flints, barrels, and nails in payment for the relics they removed, and they left Adventure Bay, concluding that a most miserable race of mortals inhabited a country capable of producing all the necessaries of life and the finest climate in the world. 1 year before, Captain Marion, a Frenchman according to the authors of his country, visited this island. The intercourse was hostile and left traces of blood, and to this may be attributed the absence of the natives when Furneaux appeared on the coast. 1777. The descriptions of Cook are founded on his own observations and are, on the whole, favourable to the natives. The English, while wooding and watering, were surprised by the visit of 8 men and a boy. They were unarmed, except that one of them carried a stick, pointed at the end. They were of middling stature, slender and naked. On different parts of their bodies were ridges, both straight and curved, raised in the skin. The hair of the head and beard was smeared with red ointment. They were indifferent to presents. They rejected bread and the flesh of the sea elephant, but accepted some birds, which they signified their intention to eat. Cook prevailed on a native to throw the stick at a mark 30 yards distant, but he failed after repeated trial. The Otaheitean, Oh My, to exhibit his skill, fired off a musket. At the report they fled, and so great was their fear that they dropped the axe and knives they had received. A dead calm retarded the departure of the vessels next day, and the parties sent ashore were accompanied by Cook. About 20 natives soon joined them. One, who was conspicuously deformed, amused them by the drollery of his gestures and the seeming humour of his speeches. Some wore 3 or 4 folds round the neck, made of fur, and round the ankles a slip of the skin of kangaroo. Captain Cook returned to the vessel, leaving Lieutenant King in charge. Soon after, the women and children arrived. They were introduced by the men to the English. The children were thought pretty. Of the beauty of the women, the account was not equally favourable. They rejected with disdain the presence and freedoms of the officers and were ordered by an elderly man to retire, a command to which they submitted with reluctance. Dr. Anderson, the surgeon of the Resolution, describes the natives as a mild, cheerful race, with an appearance less wild than is common to savages. He considered them devoid of activity, genius, and intelligence. Their countenance he delineates as plump and pleasing. 1792. But though later on the spot, assisted by the remarks of previous observers, Labillardière of all was the most assiduous and exact. The naturalist. Of D'Entrecasteaux's expedition he saw mankind with the eye of a philosopher. He was pleased to examine the passions of a race, least of all indebted to art, yet the prevailing notions of citizen Frenchmen, perhaps, gave him a bias when estimating an uncivilized people. He left Europe when the dreams of Rousseau were the toys of the speculative, and before they became the phantoms of the populace. His observations were doubtlessly correct, but his grouping is artistic and not without illusion. In his work, the Tasmanian blacks appear in the most charming simplicity, harmless and content, an extraordinary remnant of primitive innocence. At first, they fled from the French. An old woman they chased took a leap which, if credible, was terrific. She dashed over a precipice 40 feet high and was lost. Among the rocks, La Billardière, having landed with several companions, proceeded towards a lake. Hearing human voices, they followed the direction of the sound. The sudden cry of the natives induced them to return for their arms. Then, proceeding towards the woods, they met the tribe. The men and boys in a semicircle, with the women and children behind. La Billardière offered a piece of biscuit and held out his hand, which a savage chief accepted, and smiling drew back 1 foot and bowed with admirable grace. He gave to the French a necklace, which he called canteride, formed of wilk shells, in exchange for articles of dress, a poleaxe, and knives. The proportions are worth remarking. In a party of 40, there were 8 men and 7 women. Of 48, there were 10 men and 14 women. Thus the females were most numerous, and the rising generation nearly 1/3 more than the adults. They were generally healthy. One only suffered from cutaneous disease, one from a defect of vision, and several from slight wounds. It will be told that a sad reverse was afterwards their fate. The French, supposing they subsisted on fish, expected to find leprosy, and concluded not that other food was procured, but that the doctors were mistaken. The women and girls were the fishers. They plunged amidst seaweed and raised the shellfish from rocks by the spatula. They killed the crayfish before landing. They could endure the water twice as long as Europeans. In the intervals of diving, they roasted their spoil and warmed themselves between 2 fires, sometimes feeding their children or themselves. Thus they continued alternately fishing and cooking until all were satisfied. The men seemed indolent. Nothing could persuade them to dive. They sauntered about, with the right hand passed behind and holding the left forearm in its grasp. As the elders moved with gravity on the beach, the girls romped and raced with the seamen, repelling, without resenting, their rudeness. They were sprightly and voluble, and chatted on without intermission. On one occasion they were missed, when, turning to a tree, they were seen perched naked in the branches, about 9 feet from the ground. An interesting group, remarks the naturalist. In the incidents of their social life he saw their character. The children cried. Their mothers soothed them with those maternal caresses which art has not improved. They held them to be decorated by the French and placed them in their arms. A father corrected a little boy for the ancient diversion of throwing stones at another, and the culprit wept. A lad concealed a basket from a seaman to amuse by his perplexity and its dexterous replacement. The clothes given by the French they hung on the bushes, but they valued the tin ware, the axes and saws. The liberality of their visitors induced them to take more than was given, but they seemed unconscious of offence, and whatever was required they restored without reluctance. A girl, refusing the French a skin they desired to possess, retreated to the woods. Her friends were distressed at her ill nature. She, at last, complied. A pair of trousers were given in exchange. She stood between 2 Frenchmen, leaning on the shoulder of each, while they guided her errant legs into these novelties of Europe. Their refusal of food, for themselves and children, was from distaste rather than distrust, and they only discovered suspicion when the French penetrated the country. They posted a guard to give notice of any movement, and when an attempt was made, it was interrupted by the loud screams of the women and the entreaties of the men. They resisted the intrusion with displeasure and even menace. On other occasions, they tended on the French with great kindness, removing fallen branches from their path, and when the ground was sloping and slippery, they walked beside them and held them up. They rested every half-mile, saying "Medi, sit down," then rising again after a few minutes' rest. They themselves first saw the French, who, having travelled several miles, lay down for the night near a brook. Their fires betrayed them. A native next morning pointed to their resting place, laid his head on his hand and closed his eyes. The good nature of these people never languished. Twice, when the French lost their way, they directed them to their ships. They welcomed their visits by raising their hands over their heads, shouting and stamping on the ground. They greeted them as often as their wanderings brought them in sight of the vessels, and with the same friendly sounds bade them adieu. 1798. We owe to Captain Flinders and Dr. Bass the next description of the natives. They were saluted by voices from the hills which border the Derwent. One of these they ascended and saw a man and two women who, catching up their baskets, scampered away. The man met them with confidence. They tried, in vain, to converse with him in the dialects of New Holland. They desired him to lead them to his hut, but he hesitated and moved slowly in the direction to which he had pointed. Consulting his apparent feelings, they desisted and parted in friendship. This was the first man they had seen in the island. His countenance they describe as unusually benignant, his features less Negro-like than common, and his manners frank and open. He exhibited neither curiosity nor fear, nor did he seem attracted by any part of their dress, except their cravats. Mr. Bass made several expeditions into the country, attended only by his dogs, and meeting no inhabitants, he concluded that their numbers were inconsiderable. The accounts descriptive of native customs by these authorities are full of errors, but they are the errors of inference, not of observation. It is useless to repeat, in order to correct them. The colonists have possessed better opportunities, and their acquaintance with aboriginal habits supplies more accurate information than could be expected in the volumes of navigators. Such as we have given is their testimony to the social aspect of the native character. Nothing unfavorable is omitted. In a people so gentle and affable, it is difficult to recognize the race afterwards covered with sores, wasted by want and vice, or animated with revenge, and who filled the colony with disgust and terror. End of chapter 42. This being the Aborigines. Section 1.